Welcome to this first session of a Bible study inspired by Brene Brown's book, Rising Strong. In her book, she writes about what it takes to get yourself back up after a difficult situation. She identifies 3 stages of this process. The first is the reckoning, when we admit that there is a problem. The second stage is the rumble, where we really dig deep into what is going on and what it might take to get out of that difficult situation. And the third stage is the revolution, where action and change take place. I've taken these 3 stages and chosen one Old Testament story and one New Testament story for each stage. So for this first study, we have an Old Testament story about a reckoning. This is the story of Esther, and the reckoning happens in chapter 4. But to understand why that happened, we need to know the entire story of Esther. So here is a summary of chapters 1 through 3 of the Bible book of Esther. King Ahasuerus ruled over the Persian Empire during this time, and he chose Esther as his queen through a beauty pageant. He had disposed of his first queen after she refused to walk naked in front of his friends. Esther had an uncle named Mordecai that was an inspiration and a mentor for her. During this time, there's a man named Haman who became the second in command. Now, Haman had the king make a decree that everyone must bow down to him. But Mordecai, being a Jew, refused to bow down to anyone other than God. This frustrated Haman so much that he wanted payback. But he decided that he didn't just want to kill Mordecai, but that he wanted to kill all of the Jews. So Haman manipulated King Ahasuerus to be okay killing an entire group of people. The king gives Haman his ring so that Haman can write out the decree, stating that at a certain date in the near future, all Persians are allowed and encouraged to rise up against the Jews and to kill them. When Mordecai heard about the decree, he tore his clothes and he put on sackcloth and ashes, and he went through the city wailing loudly. He went up to the king's gate, but because he was wearing sackcloth and ashes, he was not allowed to go through the king's gate to the palace courts. When word spread to the rest of the Jews in the region, they also put on sackcloth and ashes and wailed. They refused to eat. When Esther's servants told her about how Mordecai was acting, she became visibly shaken. She sent some regular clothes to Mordecai, but he refused them. So then she sent one of her male servants to Mordecai to understand what was going on. So Mordecai told this servant that Haman has declared that all of the Jews would be destroyed. And Mordecai knew the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to put in the treasury in exchange for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also sent a copy of the decree with the servant, and he sent this message to Esther, telling her to go before the king and to beg him to show kindness and to save her people. When Esther heard this, she sent word back to Mordecai saying, "You know as well as I do that nobody can go before the king unannounced or uninvited. The consequence is death. Only those will live whom the king extends his golden scepter." Well, Mordecai sent word back to Esther through this servant, saying, "Do not think that because you are living in the palace that you will be spared. The Jewish people may be saved by another means, but you and your family will be destroyed if you don't do anything. But maybe you entered this royal palace for such a time as this." So Esther sent word back to Mordecai saying, "Tell all of the Jews in the city to fast for 3 days. Do not eat or drink anything. I and my female servants will do the same, and this will give me the courage and the bravery that I will need to go before the king uninvited. And if I die because of this, then so be it." So then Mordecai did everything that she asked. 3 days later, Esther approached the king. When the king saw her, he lit up and he extended his scepter to her. She touched it, and the king said, "What do you want? Even half the kingdom?" And she said, "Come to a feast that I have prepared and bring Haman." And so he did. And at this feast, the king asked her again, "What do you want? Even half the kingdom?" And she said, "Come back tomorrow for another feast." And so they did. Haman, the king, and Esther were at this second dinner sipping wine when the king asked her again, "What is it that you want?" And Esther said, "If it pleases the king, I ask that you save my life and the lives of my people. You see, we have been sold to be destroyed." Then the king said to her, "Who would have caused such a thing?" And then Esther said, "One who hates. This man, Haman, Well, the king was so furious that he stormed out of the room. Haman, realizing that his life was on the line, he knelt on the couch next to the queen, begging for his life. But then the king came back and saw Haman so close to the queen and said, "Do you now attempt to molest my queen?" So that very day, the king had Haman killed. On the apparatus that Haman had built to kill Mordecai. That same day, the king gave all of Haman's possessions to Esther. She told the king that Mordecai was her uncle. And so then the king brought Mordecai into the palace, and he gave Mordecai his royal ring, the one used to seal royal decrees. Then once again, the queen begged him, "Please save my people. Take back this previous decree." But the king explained that once a decree goes out, he can't take it back. But he can write a new decree. So he had Mordecai write a decree saying that on that day when the Persians will rise up against the Jews are allowed to rise up and defend themselves. When the decree went out, all of the Jews rejoiced and celebrated. And when that fated day came, there were some enemies of the Jews who rose up against them. But the Jews defended themselves. They killed 500 or more that day, including the 10 sons of Haman. It is that day that is celebrated as Purim, the Jewish holiday, when Esther saved her people. Here ends the lesson. Like all of the stories that we are going to look at during these 6 weeks, the story of Esther has these 3 components that Brene Brown shares in her book, Rising Strong. Esther has the moment of reckoning, of rumbling, and of revolution. I think that her reckoning is that moment in chapter 4 when Mordecai says to her, "Do not think that you will be spared because you live in the palace." That is Esther's moment of realizing that there is a problem. She has read the decree, and now she realizes that she has to do something about it. And then she has the rumble that those 3 days when she and her servants and all of the Jews in the city are fasting. Those 3 days are not just time for her to build up her bravery so that she can go before the king. But I think that also is the time that she needs to make her game plan, to figure out how she will work the system to get what she wants. She has to be careful to ensure that the king will save her people and that this plan won't backfire on her. And then there is the revolution, that moment at that second dinner when she says, save my people. That is the beginning of the revolution, of all of the change. How Haman gets killed, how Mordecai and the king create a new decree, how all of the Jews are spared because they are allowed to defend themselves when bigots come to attack them. There is so much more to consider about this story. So we are going to continue this over Zoom, where we can dig deeper, not just into the story of Esther, but also into Brene Brown's book. I will have more discussion questions and more quotes from her book. But in the meantime, and in case you can't attend this Zoom discussion about Esther, here are 6 discussion questions for you to consider. How would you define Esther's moments of reckoning, rumbling, and revolution? Do you agree with mine? Why was Esther so reluctant to try to save her people? What might you have done differently in her situation? And be honest, would you have had enough bravery to go before the king? Would you have been able to make up a plan that would succeed? What current events has this story reminded you of? There is so much that I am thinking about right now. Where is God in this story? The story talks about the Jewish people, but it doesn't mention God specifically. So where do you see God in this story? And how can God help you to reckon, rumble, and revolution those events in your life that you need to deal with? I will either see you on Zoom Wednesday evening at 6 p.m. or I will see you next week with a new story.